Alrighty, ladies and gents, welcome to this episode of Lectures with Liddington. So we just finished up talking about the cell theory and some very important people, very important scientists involved in piecing together those principles. So now we're going to start diving into the cells, those cells themselves. But first, I want to start out with classifying them. There are so many different types of cells out there. So let's just talk first about how we can categorize them. So one of the ways that we can categorize cells is by how many. There are organisms out there composed of many different numbers of cells. So we can break organisms into unicellular and multicellular organisms. So unicellular, uni means one. So uni means one or single. So a unicellular organism is an organism that's composed of one single cell. It can survive all on its own. If we look down here, this is an amoeba. Amoebas are unicellular organisms. Some other examples would include bacteria or paramecium. They're these little single-celled water-dwelling organisms. Or yeast, actually, yeast are a unicellular organism. If you buy a little packet and you put that in the bread that you make, those are actually unicellular organisms that you're using in order to make that bread. Then we have lots of different kinds of organisms that would be considered multicellular, multi meaning many. So you and I, we are multicellular organisms. We are organisms composed of many, many, many different cells. These are the ones that we think of, more commonly, like plants and animals. Different fungus are multicellular as well. So we can also look deeper at the cells themselves when we talk about differences in cells. And we can classify them into two main categories based off of their complexity. And those are prokaryotes and eukaryotes. So pro rhymes with no, which is a good way to remember that it has no nucleus. So this is a really important distinction when we start moving on in our units. But prokaryotes they're really small, incredibly small, and very simple. And they have no nucleus. So their genetic information is just out in the midst of that cell. There's no protective barrier. And because they're so simple, they also have no membrane-bound organelles. Which we'll get to in 1 second. What does that mean? So the examples of organisms that are prokaryotes, if we look down here at the bottom of the screen, these are all different types of bacteria. So the kingdom Bacteria and the kingdom Archaea. Those are the two groups of organisms that would be considered prokaryotes. Everything else would be a eukaryote. So eukaryotes, these are significantly more complex. So these are going to be much larger, more complex. So even if you're looking at a unicellular eukaryote, it's going to be at least 10 times the size. So they are significantly larger than a prokaryote would be. So because they're larger and more complex, this means they do have that nucleus, which is right in the center. If you look at a cell under a microscope, you'll see a big circle in the middle, which is usually darker than everything else. That's that nucleus. And then throughout that cell, you're also going to have membrane-bound organelles. Okay, cool, Mrs. Liddington. You're using this word organelles again. Well, what does that mean? Well, if you think about in your own body, an organ is a part, right? It's a part of your body that has a job. Your heart is pumping blood. Your lungs are helping you intake that oxygen, right? So every organ has a job. Organelle just means baby organ. So organelles are little parts of that cell that have different jobs. When you get large, like these eukaryotes, you need to have specific organelles that have specific jobs because you're so big and you have a lot of things to do. Cells are really busy. So they have a lot of processes that they need to undergo. So they have these different organelles. They divide and conquer. And different organelles will have different jobs. So who's a eukaryote? These are the ones that kind of come to mind first when we think about cells and living things. Plants and animals, things like that. This pretty little flower down here on the bottom would be considered a eukaryote. If we looked at those cells, they'd be large, complex. They would have these membrane-bound organelles and that really nice distinct nucleus. So the other way we can classify these cells are by what kingdom the organism belongs to. So plants, animals, protists, fungus, bacteria, and archaea. These are the different kingdoms of organisms. Down here, bacteria and archaea, these are going to be our prokaryotes. Archaea are essentially a very specialized type of bacteria, and they live in more extreme environments. So those, when you hear about cells that survive in hydrothermal vents and things like that, you're probably looking at archaea in those kind of situations. Then plants, animals, and protists, all the rest of these, and fungi, there is an appropriate enunciation. Figured I'd bring that up. These are all eukaryotes. So if we look here, our protists, these are all unicellular. Plants and animals, these are multicellular. And fungi can be uni or multicellular. It depends. Fungi could be mushrooms, right? Or you can have ones like yeast. That yeast are actually a fungus, but they're unicellular. And then if we look sort of foreshadowing, I guess, towards where we're going to go in the future, as we dive into cells, we're going to look more at their structures. And the two that we're going to dive into the most deeply are going to be plants and animals. These are both, like I said, multicellular. But even though they're both multicellular and they're both eukaryotes, they're really different. When you zoom in on the cells, there's going to be some structures that are similar, but there are also going to be some structures that differ. So even within all these different categories, they'll have some consistencies, but they're also going to be really different. Specifically, we're going to dive into plants, animals, and a little bit about bacteria as well as we move on. So we are going to stop right there, do a little practice.